So the first thing you'll want to do is make sure you transferred all the notches onto your pattern pieces. You should have the center notch for the cuffs and the ruffle, the sleeve seams for one of the neckbands, and the armhole notches on the sleeves and the back and front pieces. The second step is to interface one neckband, the button placket, and the cuffs. Interface the neckband that has no markings or notches on the wrong side of the fabric, and this one will be used as the outer neckband. Then we'll form the pleat on both front yokes and the back yoke. To do so, fold the yoke bottom edge toward the wrong side of the fabric by 2 centimeters. I like to use my heat erasable pen to mark my line on the right side of the fabric first, and then I press to create a crease. You could also measure as you press, then set aside. The next step is to create basting stitches on the front pieces and the back. We're going to sew 2 rows on the right side of the fabric, leaving long tails of threads at both ends. Put your tension down and your stitch length to max, and sew the first one at 6 millimeters and the second one at 1.2 millimeters seam allowance. To assemble the yokes to the front and back pieces, unfold the yoke pleats and place each front yoke on its corresponding front, right sides together. Flip it so that the wrong side of the front is facing you. Pin the sides and pull on the threads to gather the fabric until its width matches the yoke, and then repeat for the other front and the back. Then sew together at 1 centimeter seam allowance with the gathers facing up, and remove the basting stitches. Finish the raw edges without trimming any of the seam allowance. From the right side of one of the fronts, fold the pleat over the gathered seam and pin it. Repeat for the other front and the back. Then sew the pleat at 6 millimeters from its folded edge, making sure the seam allowance underneath is lying flat toward the yoke. Then it's optional, but you can sew another top stitching line 4 millimeters or so above the first one on top. And then it's optional, but you can press the seams to flatten the gathers a little bit. Then we're going to sew the button placket, so fold both placket pieces in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and press. Fold one of the long edges by 1 centimeter to the wrong side and press again, and then repeat for the second placket piece and make sure it mirrors the first one, especially if you have vertical prints on your fabric. Then pin the unpressed side of one of the plackets right sides onto the wrong side of one of the front pieces, and repeat for the other front, and then sew both at 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then trim any excess length and the seam allowance down by half to reduce any bulk for the buttonholes. Press the plackets towards the seam allowance, and with the right side facing up, fold the plackets over, bringing their folded edge just over the seam you just made. Pin, making sure you catch the placket underneath. And then sew the plackets 2-3 millimeters from the edge and press. Then you have the option to edge stitch the other edge of the placket, and then sew 2 more lines of top stitching along each seam you just made, so towards the center of the button placket, and I like to make them 4 millimeters away from each other, but it's up to you. The next step is to attach the sleeves to the bodice, so place one of the front and the back to the corresponding sleeve, right sides together, matching the armholes notches. Then sew at 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then repeat for the other sleeve and finish the seams and press the seam allowances toward the sleeve. Then we're going to sew the neckband. So create basting stitches all around the neckline of your bodice by sewing 2 rows on the right side of the fabric. So the first one at 5 millimeters and the second at 1.2 away from the edge. To make gathering the neckline easier, I like to do this in separate sections, so in 5 sections, so the front, the sleeve, the back, the other sleeve, and the other front. So for each section, I like to backstitch on one side to lock the basting stitches in place, and this will allow you to adjust the gathers from one side only without the gathering unraveling on the other side. Then, to help guide you when pressing the seam allowance, sew basting stitches on the outer neckband, so the interfaced one, at 7mm seam allowance from the outer edge. Then press that seam allowance towards the wrong side along the basting stitches you just made, and then remove them. On the inner edge of the wrong side, mark the seam allowance of 1 cm on the short edges as well to help guide you when sewing, so this is optional. Then place both neckbands right sides together with the outer neckband on top and pin. Then sew both neckbands together using the line you just made at 1 cm seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And in the center front curves, go slowly, and if needed, turn your fabric after each stitch to follow the curve precisely. It might be easier if you lower your stitch length to 2. Then clip the seam allowance and trim it to half its width. Then from the right side, press the outer neckband towards the wrong side just at the seam. Then flip it so that the wrong side of the inner neckband is facing you. Then bring the outer neckband over so that the neckbands are wrong sides together, and make sure the corners are turned right sides as well. Then press the seam, making sure it is sitting on the edge or slightly rolled under towards the inner neckband. And to do this, I like to roll it between my fingers to get it right to the edge. And I do this segment by segment, starting with the center. Then pin the right side of the inner neckband to the wrong side of the neckline, matching the sleeve seams to the notches on the neckband and aligning the center front. From the right side, gather each section of the neckline so that their width matches the neckbands, and spread the gathers evenly and pin as much as needed. Then sew the inner neckband at 7mm seam allowance. To start, place your needle right next to the folded center front of the neckband, making sure to backstitch. Use a hump jumper or a piece of folded fabric here placed under your presser foot to start stitching if it's a little bit bulky. Unpick the back stitches you made and remove the gathering stitches. Then I like to trim the seam allowance at the placket to reduce bulk for the buttonhole. And from the right side, press the seam allowance towards the neckband. Then bring the outer neckband over to the right side, placing the folded edge on top of the seam you just sewed, barely covering it. Pin, and don't be afraid to use a lot of them. And then make sure your neckband is laying flat and placed in its final shape when pinning, like a circle. It will help you get it right where it needs to be. Then you have two options. You can sew the neckband 2-3mm away from the edge from center front to center front, making sure to catch the neckband underneath as best as you can. Or you can also sew all around the neckband, so the inner edge and the outer edge, which is what I'm doing here. Once you're done sewing, you can check on the wrong side that your stitching is regular, and if not, you can unpick and fix it, but it won't be visible. Then lay your neckline flat in a circle and give it a good press. Mark the bottom of the bottom buttonhole 7 cm from the bottom raw edge, and then space and mark the rest of your buttonholes evenly. You should have 4 buttonholes on the placket, and then mark the buttonhole on the neckband as well. You also want to mark the drawstrings buttonhole on both front pieces following the measurements given in the pattern. And it's optional. If you have a thin fabric, you might want to add a small piece of interfacing on the wrong side to make sewing the buttonhole easier. Then sew the buttonholes using your sewing machine's instruction, and make sure to do a test on scrap fabric first. Then open all of your buttonholes, and I like to place a pin perpendicular to the buttonhole at the top to stop my seam ripper from accidentally ripping through the buttonhole thread. Then we're going to sew the sleeve placket. Then this step is optional but strongly recommended if your fabric is thin or it frays easily, like linen, double gauze, handcrafted cotton. So here I will do it because I'm using double gauze. So we're going to reinforce the slit before cutting it. So I make a seam 2 millimeter all around the slit with a really short stitch length. So I put mine to 1. At the apex of the slit, I backstitch to reinforce that area even further. Then cut into the sleeve to create a slit. So with the sleeve right side up, place the binding right side up underneath, aligning the raw edges and the seam allowance at the wrist. Then backstitch and slightly shift your sleeve to the left by no more than 6 millimeters. And sew at 6 millimeters parallel to the binding edge. Stop 1 stitch past the apex of the slit, making sure your seam just hits the sleeve edge. So at the apex of the slit, you won't have any seam allowance. Your stitches will be right at the edge of the sleeve. Then keeping your needle in and the binding straight, lift your presser foot and shift the sleeve to the left to align the raw edge of the slit with the raw edge of the binding at the wrist. Then keep sewing at 6 millimeters parallel to the edge of the binding. Then bring the binding over so the wrong side is facing up and finger press the seam allowance towards the binding. Then we're going to understitch the seam allowance to the binding, making sure it is laying flat underneath. Then fold the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the seam allowance and then fold it again, bringing that folded edge just over the seam you just sewed. Edge stitch the binding to the sleeve. Then you'll fold your binding in half with the right side of the sleeves together and back tack diagonally across the fold. It's to create a V shape at the binding. And start at the stitches and back stitch. Then fold the side of the binding that is on the front of the sleeve inward and back tack a few millimeters from the edge to keep it folded inwards. This will overlap the back side of the sleeves when closed. Then repeat for the other sleeve and trim the excess binding. Then we're going to finish the bodice, so matching the sleeve seams, right sides together, pin the bodice side seams from the wrist to the hemline, and sew together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then finish the seams and press towards the back. Then pin both front pieces together at the bottom, center front. Place the side with the buttonholes on top of the other side and sew at just under 2 centimeters just to keep them together. The next step is to sew the cuffs. So on the right side, create 2 rows of basting stitches at the sleeves cuffs from one side of the slit to the other. Sew the first one at 5 millimeters and the second at 1.2 and leave long tails of threads at the beginning and end. Then fold both cuffs in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and press to create a crease. Then press the long edge that doesn't have the notch by 7 millimeters towards the wrong side. Make sure both cuffs mirror each other, especially if you have prints. Then pin the right side of the cuff to the wrong side of the sleeve, aligning the center notches, and leave 1 centimeter of the cuff's short raw edges hanging off on both sides. Pull on the threads to gather the sleeve until its width matches the cuffs and distribute the gathers evenly. Then sew with the gathers facing up with a 7 millimeter seam allowance and remove the gathering stitches. So to close the short sides of the cuffs, we're going to fold it in half right sides together. Pin and sew at 1 centimeter seam allowance on the short edges, making sure not to catch the edge of the sleeve. Then you'll turn the cuffs right side out, making sure the corners are neat, and bring the folded edge just over the seam. pin, making sure to catch the cuff inside. Sew all around the cuff 2-3 millimeters away from the folded edge and press. Then sew the buttonholes on the cuffs on the front side of the sleeve, close to the edge. Then we're going to sew the drawstring tie. So here I am making it in two pieces. So first we're going to sew their short edges together at 1 centimeter seam allowance and press it open. Then fold its short edges over to the wrong side by 1 centimeter. Then fold it in half lengthwise, right sides together and press. And then sew at 6 millimeter away from the folded edge. And then trim the seam allowance down by half. Then I like to use a loop turner to turn it inside out, but you can use your preferred method. Then we're going to make the ruffles. So sew the ruffles short edges together at 1 centimeter seam allowance, finish and press to one side. Then hem the ruffle by folding over one of its long edges twice by 6 millimeter. Press, pin and edge stitch. And if you have one, you can use the rolled hem presser foot like I am using here. I love it. It's so practical and makes a really neat hem. Then place the blouse and ruffle right sides together, aligning the raw edge of the ruffle to the bottom edge of the blouse and the seam of the ruffle to one of the side seams of the blouse. Pin and sew using a 2 centimeter seam allowance. And when sewing over the button placket in the center front, make sure both sides are laying well on top of each other. Then finish the seam, but do not trim any fabric from the edge. We'll need all of that seam allowance to create the drawstring casing. Then press the seam allowance toward the bodice, and you can do this from the wrong side and also from the right side to make sure it's really neat. Then we're going to create the casing, and to help guide you when sewing, you can trace a line 1.5 centimeter away from the seam, but this is optional. Personally, that 1.5 centimeter falls right next to my serger stitches, so I just follow that. When sewing over the button placket, make sure both sides are laying well on top of each other and that you are sewing over the buttonholes as well. Then it's time to insert our drawstring in the casing. Then it's time to insert the drawstring in the casing through one of the buttonholes with a safety pin. So feed it through the casing until you reach the other buttonhole. And then finish the drawstring's ends however you like. I simply like to make a knot. So then for the bodice and the cuffs, with the button plackets aligned, use a pen, chalk or pins to mark through the buttonholes to where your buttons should be placed. And then hand sew your buttons. And here you have it, your Lennon blouse is done. I hope you enjoyed making it. Make sure to check out my testers versions on Instagram. You can see a lot of them. It's super inspiring, and a big thank you to all of them again. And thank you for watching this tutorial, and see you in the next.